Hello and welcome to all. I feel really obliged because we are joined by Narayan Lakshman, who was ex-US correspondent of the Hindu Group and right now the director of Kasturi and Sons Limited. So, sir, I'm really thankful that you have joined and given me your precious time. Sir, currently, Ukraine and Russia crisis is going on. So, what are your general views on this?
Well, I think my understanding is that the world is united for the most part in condemning or at least critiquing strongly any territorial incursion by one country into the sovereign territory and geography of any other. There are concerns surrounding human rights, war crimes, and all of those things when such an action happens. And in that regard, most countries, including India, have called for all the involved parties in this case to show restraint and for dialogue and negotiation to be the main sort of protocol and process to bring about peace again between Russia and Ukraine. I think once you take that apart a little bit more, you'll see that there are some nations which have outright condemned Russia's action. And there are nations which have imposed sanctions on Russia. And there are some nations, including India, which have done neither of those things in terms of either condemnation or sanctions. But, they have expressed quite clearly that they hope for a speedy resolution of the conflict. That is my sense of where things stand today.
Right, sir, right. So, people around the world are seeing Putin there are two images of the Putin. Like on one hand, they are seeing him as a hero who is trying to save his country from Western influence, while the other half are seeing him as a person who is doing war crime in order to by brutality he has been doing in Ukraine. So, what are your thoughts on this?
So this is a fairly complex question because depending on who you talk to, there are two sides of the story, as in many things in foreign policy. The first part of it is that, when you look at history, going right back to the post-World War II period, and you look at how the Cold War kicked off between the two superpowers, the US on one side and the Soviet Union at the time on the other, what happened was that NATO was formed as a counterweight to the Soviet and communist influence in Eastern Europe mainly. And on the other side, the Soviet Union at the time formed the Warsaw Pact, which also pulled in what are now known as the Baltic states and so on into its ambit. So the Cold War was really about these two alliances being opposed to each other. Now, this is where it gets interesting because in the 1950s, the US Secretary of State, I think Baker at the time made a verbal commitment that NATO would not seek to expand even 1 inch eastward. And the Soviet Union at the time, the leadership, understood that to be that NATO, while it was free to carry on its activities in the transatlantic region, it would not bring in more and more Eastern Bloc socialist republics into its own, under its own umbrella. Because the more it did so, and the closer it advanced to the Soviet border, what is the so-called Iron Curtain, the greater the security threat perceived by Moscow. So Moscow at that time understood comments by people such as Baker, from the US Secretary of State, and indeed others, to be a promise that they would not expand eastward. However, the understanding that actually the US and Western European powers had was only pertaining to the situation between East and West Germany. As you know, Germany was bifurcated, and there was the East and the West. The East was under the control of the Soviet side. The West Germany was under the control of the Allies, and there was the whole Berlin Wall. And at the time, as long as Germany had not yet undergone reunification, the Soviets had extreme concern that East Germany would also fall to the Allies. So the promise that Baker and others made about not 1 inch eastward actually pertained to what is called the 2+4 agreement, which only related to the situation in Germany. The Western allies and NATO as such, if you ask them today, their claim is we made no such promise regarding any broader eastward expansion. We were only talking about the German situation. And as we know what happened to the German situation towards 1991, when the Soviet Union itself collapsed and then the Warsaw Pact collapsed, is that Germany was unified and Germany as such was well within the Western Bloc. There was no question of Germany being part of anything else, including the Soviet bloc. So at the same time, I think the collapse of the Soviet Union, however, made the Kremlin and Moscow even more insecure, because now there was a threat that many more of the former Soviet republics would fall into the arms of NATO. And therefore, the threat at Russia's western border would increase. So during the 90s, Russian President Boris Yeltsin repeatedly wrote many letters and brought up at different forums this concern to, let's say, US President Bill Clinton and others, saying you cannot continue to bring in former Soviet republics into NATO. And what they started saying with increasing sense of alarm is, if you do so, over time, you will be precipitating a war, in the sense you will cause us to act aggressively and territorially, and we will have to defend our borders. So, as I said, there are two sides of the story. One side of the story, on NATO's side, if you ask them, they will tell you, we never made any promise not to expand our borders. We were only talking about Germany. If you ask the other side, that is the Soviet side, which then became the Russian side, they will say, NATO from its very beginning in the 1950s has always wanted to be in expansionist mode. It has always wanted to threaten our western border. And therefore, after a whole range of former Soviet states entered NATO, the last straw was for a country like Ukraine to come under NATO's power. It has not yet happened, of course, but preemptively, to prevent such a thing and to send a signal to other powers that might contemplate joining NATO, Russia had no choice but to act and to right the balance of power within Ukraine. So these are the two sides of the argument.
Quite clear, sir. Thank you so much. So India is following, like if you talk about with Indian perspective, Indian diplomatic perspective, India is following isolation strategy by abstaining in not voting in United Nations neither against Russia and neither for Ukraine. And which is actually creating a chaos in US. Like many voices from USA has said that there might be some sanctions that can be imposed over India if India does not react positively or like accordingly to what US says. So do you see Indian diplomacy working positively here?
But firstly, I don't see the Indian position as so much in terms of isolationism as I do in terms of non-alignment. There's a few shades of difference between those two. Isolationism suggests not engaging with either side in the event of a broader global conflict or a polarized situation between superpowers. Whereas to me, non-alignment, and I think to the Indian foreign policy bureaucracy, non-alignment refers more to a very studied position of not committing to ideologies on either side, so that in the future you will retain the option of having positive diplomatic ties with both sides. It's a far more thoughtful and positive position as opposed to isolation. So having clarified that, what you're saying is correct. There is a sense that India is stepped back from this conflict and is not allowing itself to become polarized within the conflict. And of course, the United Nations, including the Security Council and the General Assembly, it's an important ground, sort of a global ground where this is debated. And as we know, I think there have been 3 motions against Russia so far, mostly to condemn Russian aggression and Russian action across the Ukraine border. And India has abstained in all 3 cases, as you correctly said. So I think there are several things to consider here from the US perspective, what you said about the possibility of sanctions. Firstly, the United States does recognize that India and Russia share a special relationship. Whether you're talking about statements by senior administration officials speaking on Capitol Hill last week, or whether you're talking about other statements made by even this up to the Secretary of State in the State Department in the US, they have all recognized that India has not just civilizational, but also very deep defense ties with Russia as one of the largest sort of supplier nations for India in terms of weaponry and other military products and equipment. So I think India cannot stop factoring that in to its calculus in terms of how it votes and behaves vis-a-vis Russia. That's the first point. The second point is the United States has actually been quite understanding of this special relationship, even in a longer arc of history. So there is the complex question of India purchasing the S-400 anti-missile battery system, for which India has got a sanctions waiver from the US in the past. And my understanding from my vantage position in the media and speaking to people in think tanks is that sanctions waiver position will continue. That's my feeling. I'm not saying that that has officially been announced yet, but that is my guess if you would ask me to hazard such a guess. So I think from America's perspective, we now live in a multi-regional world. We have groupings such as the Quad or the Quadrilateral Security Dialogue. You have ASEAN. You have so many different multilateral agreements and orders where the US and India participate along with other nations, or they independently participate with other nations but interact with each other. And in such a complex sort of interlocking multilateral arrangements, it is not possible for the US or India to go out on a limb and attack the other country diplomatically just because they do not see eye to eye on a specific regional conflict such as Russia, Ukraine. So what I mean by that is Washington would rather keep New Delhi engaged in dialogue across various different platforms and regional arrangements and work on coming to a common viewpoint with India rather than use a blunt an instrument such as sanctions or other forms of condemnation of India in a public forum, which would actually have a negative effect and would set diplomatic relations backward, not forward.
Thank you, sir. It means that there is no bad implication between US and India relationship, accordingly. So
I don't think, yes.
Any other implications that India might face either diplomatically or economically in this crisis going on?
Well, certainly, I think many countries with linkages to the Russian economy, especially in terms of energy markets, because Russia is a major importer of gas and other forms of fuel, and also commodities. They export a variety of commodities across the world. I think there's going to be a very, very strong knock-on effect in the sphere of economics and markets because the ruble has crashed. Supply chains are being choked off at various points. The whole world, the global economy was at a very fragile point of recovery in the post-COVID context. Because of crippling lockdowns across many market economies, already economic growth has taken a very bad beating for the last 2 years. So in that fragile recovery phase, for all these nations, including India, China, the United States, Western Europe, all of them to face a second debilitating crunch in terms of supply side economics could be extremely serious and deleterious. So I think there's a chance that the recovery could be prolonged, and we will not come out of this economic crisis for quite a bit longer than what we expected or hoped for because of this Ukraine-Russia conflict. My hope and understanding is that if after undertaking whatever they have in terms of military operations in Ukraine, if Russia can return to the negotiating table with Ukrainian leaders, maybe even with Western powers, there could be some conditions whereby a ceasefire is declared. Maybe Russian troops can even be pulled back out of Ukrainian territory with some security guarantees. And that could lead to greater stability. So I think India's first big concern relates to the economic sphere, because we are very much in that recovery phase right now. So that is the first point. The second point relates to the strategic question of how will the West as such respond to the Russian aggression, and will it affect India? I think the West, especially NATO, as I said, is being extremely circumspect. On one hand, they have been quite aggressive and quick in putting on sanctions in terms of cutting off Russia's technology exports and choking off the Russian economy. So they've done that quite fast. But on the other hand, I think Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky pleaded with Europe as well as with the US to enforce a no-fly zone by NATO over Ukrainian airspace, which they all refused to do. And the reason is NATO and the West as such realized that if they impose a no-fly zone and they shoot down a Russian aircraft, Russia could respond massively, that the retaliation could be unacceptable. It could involve a nuclear threat. And I think both on the Western side as well as the Russian side, the experts are extremely cautious and the politicians are extremely cautious about not escalating up the nuclear ladder. So I think in terms of the military and diplomatic fallout of the fight between Russia and the West, it is going to carry on for some time, and India will have to play a balancing act. It is already playing a balancing act because, for example, it has to get innumerable Indian students out of Ukraine who are trapped and not able to reach the Polish border. So as long as such situations exist, India will have to diplomatically play a balancing act, which will also mean it will probably continue to abstain from various UNGA resolutions, and it will face the criticism for that. India has already been criticized. It will be criticized more, and it will have to just survive, grit its teeth and survive through that criticism. So I think that is the second major kind of fallout which India will have to deal with. But hopefully, if reason prevails, there will not be an escalating conflict, and India will also not be drawn into any such conflict.
Thank you so much for giving such hidden insights and making the picture more clear. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, Oscar.